And we're back after a while. Uh, we're in a church, and there's a vampire here somehow.
I lose count of how many all-night vigils it has been. What runs dry first, I wonder? Black coffee or faith?
Faith.
The coffee. My church accommodates many miracles, many mysteries. And in a town like this, it needs to. The workings of God are not always obvious, but we learn to see them in all things.
All things?
All. Feet off the pews. Buried in the graveyard, there are both villagers and also the Soviets who worked here in the past. Not a past to be proud of. But sins can be repented, and everyone is entitled to their eternal rest. Then the ghouls came from their pits, digging up the graves, gorging on the dead. I considered how we fast to regain our innocence, and I believe this is a universal truth.
Yes, I starve, but I am as pure as the Carpathian snow.
Perhaps in time it will erode your temperament, huh? I believe to deny their ghouls their foul banquet will calm them and bring peace, at least to this small sanctuary. There are many things put beneath earth that should remain beneath earth. Oh, present company accepted, of course.
Well played, Father. You have fans, after all.
Yeah, that's sort of interesting that a vampire can walk in the church and not immediately be struck down by God, but...
Well, I mean, you know, it's vampires. Who knows what they're doing in any given setting? You know, they're stock horror villains. All the only set characteristic is they drink blood, and even then, some people find ways around that. Like, okay, so I mean, let me think. Because I think I can just hit the highlights of. I need something to talk about, and we just walked out of a church, an Orthodox church. So let's talk about the early church and schisms. Okay, scroll back. So I'm talking about like Okay, do you want me to start with Christians and Lions?
Start with the Council of Nicaea, because that's where the canon was made.
That's too late, actually. If we want to talk about early church politics.
Oh, really?
Oh, by far. Oh.
Well, I'm aware that I wasn't aware the schism went back that far.
Oh no, like I mean, well, the Great Schism went back that. Honestly, I don't think that it's Nicaea that was where the Great Schism started kicking off, but like the way the Christian Church schismed in general, the way that it kept breaking over lines of authority, that goes back farther. So
I believe we covered that at one point, but go ahead.
I mean,
no, we covered Arianism. We covered Arianism.
Yeah, Arianism specifically, and that's one thing. So, been doing some research, like because I'm a nerd and I spare time into this, and the traditional narrative around Christianity is that it was an oppressed minority throughout the Roman Empire, and it eventually started winning converts over the centuries as people kept killing off Christians and they never really made a dent in the population, and it started spreading. There is evidence of that. There's also another theory that's been gaining some precedence recently, and it basically goes that there was a period in really early, like within 100 years of Jesus' life, where there were waves of missionaries and martyrs who headed out across the Roman Empire. They formed communities everywhere. These are the people who Paul wrote the letters to, you know. And after maybe 200 years, those efforts petered out almost entirely. And Christian numbers then stabilized. Yeah. They would change after the occasional round of persecutions, but it's one of those things where you'd expect Christian burials to grow more common as greater numbers of Christians started going places, you know? Except they didn't. And we also have evidence of, like, Christian communities setting down roots solid enough that they started integrating into Roman society. Because the thing about Roman religion is that, well, there are many things, but one of the things is that they really liked old things. They really thought that age was authority. And which is something, when it came to religion at least. And that's something Christians could not claim and did not claim. They specifically, at least at first, talked about it as a new revelation. And so that led Roman authorities to dismiss them as a cult. And then skip forward 200 years, and you have small communities of Christians basically everywhere in the empire, but especially in the east, and who've been there for hundreds of years. And they've had people, as long as anyone alive can remember, people's grandparents didn't remember when the first Christians arrived in the area, because that was like that was the first generation to be raised into Christianity. It had gotten old and established enough that it started to be more acceptable, even if there were a lot of sticking points that every time somebody needed to find a scapegoat, that made Christians a very convenient target. Like, Christians would...
Yes, I recall when we were in the desert doing the time travel mission, you mentioned that early Christians would do that thing where judges were like, you know, you got to give the sacrifice. And they're like, oh, we don't sacrifice. Well, I could give you an out. And you're like, no, just execute me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, martyrdom was a big thing in the early church. And that's actually really glad you brought that up. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But so by the time Constantine came around, Christianity was an established cult of the Roman Empire. And either it was growing in power and numbers, or it wasn't, but it was one of many old established cults at the time. And there were a lot of those that claimed relative amounts of age. There are a lot of, like, cults. I mentioned the cult of Sol Invictus because that comes up in this game. And there's other cult of Antinous, which Hadrian, the Roman emperor, founded. Remember his poor boyfriend.
Oh, the boy.
Yeah, the boy toy.
The boy toy cult.
Yeah, the boy toy deity. Like,
the only femboy deity.
Oh, actually, there are plenty of femboy deities. But that's another story I don't want to go into. There were a whole bunch, but the thing about Christianity, as opposed to those other religions, is that it didn't hide. Most cults at the time, whether they were traditional pagan cults or newer, like syncretic people, there were like the cult of Serapis, which was just Osiris, with slightly Roman wrapping, and some of the people spoke in Latin instead of Egyptian. And there was a bunch of different cults that were like, most cults, whether they were formal state cults or newer cults that were spreading, had strong mystery cult elements, had strongly concealed what they were talking about. Like, there were always inner mysteries and so on and so forth. And Christianity never really bothered. You could just go into this, like, walk into this random place and you could see there was a Bible. That was it. You could pick it up and read it if they felt comfortable giving it to you. It was written in very common Greek, and that was actually kind of an issue for like spreading Christianity in the early years, because they had this complex Roman, and especially in the Eastern Roman Empire, Greek had this complex around well-written Greek, about specifically Greek that's the kind of Greek that Plato wrote in, where they thought that was what smart people write in. Everyone else writes crap. And the New Testament was written in common Koine Greek, which meant everybody who had any kind of education and power looked down on it because it was written like common people stuff. And that all changed over the centuries as people started to integrate into broader broader Roman society. They started to build up their local communities, started to get rich. They started to write their own better written stuff. You started getting people like Saint Augustine and Saint Ambrose, who could write just incredible prose or just well-written, readable shit about Christianity, and that was very new. That was new enough that people actually wrote in astonishment that Christians could write that well. They would actually comment about it. We still have those letters and records. That's all kind of getting lost in the weeds. Basically, by the time Constantine came around, there were several emperors before him that had gone favored various cults, and for reasons I don't really want to get into, Constantine picked Christianity as his cult of favor and gave it a lot of patronage, started spreading it, and that's when we really have the evidence of Christian burials starting to pop up in places that they weren't before, and churches being built, and so on and so forth, like actual hard evidence of the spread. And that was a problem, because, like you said earlier, early Christians, had this thing where they saw martyrdom as basically a shortcut to heaven. You could do good works, you could live well. Like the idea of, like in modern Catholicism and modern Protestantism, they have this conflict on whether or not good works are necessary to get into heaven. That was not as, mostly, that wasn't really a thing at that point. It was kind of assumed that you had to do both, and that, you had to be worth being saved to be saved, I guess. But you could get all around that if you just told the local beleaguered Roman judge to go fuck himself, and he just sighs and signs your death warrant because he has to, and you literally asked for it, and he has no other choice. And then it was the state religion of the Roman Empire, and they no longer had the ability to do that. So there were a lot of people who were religious extremists of the kind you find everywhere, who, not like Paris level religious extremists, but the sort of people who do the term.
Oh no! Don't make excuses. Those sorts of people did exist in the Christian community.
That's not what I'm saying. Oh, they did. I'll be talking about the Circumcellions in a little bit. But
are those the ones who intentionally attacked people to get killed because they thought death was?
Yeah, they responded to this. The Circumcellions were a group in North Africa in the 400s, 500s, 600s, and they would be bandits, and they would go beat up people, random travelers, specifically to provoke them to draw their swords and kill them. And to try and get themselves murdered as a way to get into heaven. And by all accounts, they actually outlived the Roman Empire in the area to the point that they may have encountered the Muslim armies as they stormed the region.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
It's wild. But, so, okay. When I say, extremist is the wrong word, but the sort of people who do dumb things in the name of religion today, the sort of people who are really, really, really loud and aggressive on Twitter and protest things they shouldn't, and then feed a martyr complex when people criticize them, sort of people who are who are aggressive about their religion. And they would go towards these ways of martyrdom that didn't necessarily hurt anybody else, but did get themselves killed. That sort of protest. And now they can't do that anymore. That was off. And even putting themselves in danger for the religion, you could go out and try and preach to neighboring tribes, but some people did, but mostly those people just died or got ignored. There are a lot of records of missionaries who ended up going out into these areas, and they would try and distribute Roman goods to show how generous they were, and they'd have people converting 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 times to get the goods over and over again before the priest figured it out. And they just were not good at it at first. It took them a long time to figure out how to do it. So there
I taste
that
it.
at some point
Please do
some
not
of these
lead our
people
visitors
decided
into temptation,
instead of
Sebastian. This
they could
is
go
a
and just, you know, scammed by
Of
the
course
locals
it is,
elsewhere,
Father.
or
We are men
just
of
really
code and
want to
conduct. I would
go
not
like
outstay
attack
your
travelers,
welcome.
and that was
Or
that
your
was
pardon.
like
You know
nobody liked the
they ask for his
Circumcellions.
mercy on all
No,
the
not
living
even the local like.
and the dead.
For various
They
reasons, the
wanted the
Circumcellions were
army at
native
your
to
door,
North
you might
Africa,
save your
and
prayers.
North
This is
Africa
what
had
passes
a
for an
really
army.
light hand as far as like Christian
Without
suppression
honor,
goes, so the local
dogs
Christians
yapping
ended
for
up
meat,
pretty
rolling in their
radical
own
because they
piss and
hadn't had
shit
to
please
conform
their
to
mistress.
anybody. But even the most like radical
Forgive me,
people in the
Father.
area were
Be
not
sure
fans of the
I'll add it
Circumcellions.
to
They wanted to find ways that weren't
The ones who
killing,
lead
trying to
them
kill
and
random
wear the
travelers to get
uniforms
into
of
heaven, you know?
generals. Traitors
And
to
that
the
is where
flag, every
monasticism
one
was
of them.
invented. The
Those
concept
who would
of
wipe
going
their
out.
This
hands on the
actually, I want
Romanian
to
flag
interrupt you.
should
This is
be
interesting.
careful someone does not smash them out.
This vampire is
Even
pissed
someone
at the
like
other
you.
vampires because they're bowing to a
You
non-Romanian.
are too weak to destroy a blood elder. But
Even
you
though
could
technically the
lead.
person they're bowing to, I guess, is
To
pre-Romania.
reform a wampity body
But that,
from
you know,
dust is a
pre
long
still
and
means elsewhere.
agonizing process.
So in their next lives they might strive to be without sin.
So in their next lives,
And apparently
they
in this
learn
world,
to fear
getting
the
hit by
state.
a stake just disintegrates you, and you have to reform, and it's very painful. So that's another.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally you nail them with a stake, and then they just fall down dead because you damage the parts of them that animate them. But it's a secret world, you know,
They gotta have their own twist.
right?
Quick access
And they usually do,
inventory
and it's usually
updated.
interesting. But what was that? Monasticism cut me off right at the perfect start for me to jump into that. So you got like you got people who would go out and just sit around in the desert. At first they did it out on their own, on like by their lonesomes. And you had these people who a whole subculture evolved in like the 400s, and especially in Egypt, where this activity was focused. People would go out into the deserts, and they'd take these big, like 10 or 20-foot poles with a little platform on top. They'd drive the pole into the ground, and then they would sit on the pole, on the top of the pole, and not move for decades. And that's what they would do for the rest of their lives. And as an act of devotion, and people would go on pilgrimages out into the desert to visit these people and offer them things. Like they would keep the offerings of people who came to go see what they were doing, you know? And it was...
I'm sorry, I'm getting Life of Brian flashbacks.
Yeah, I mean, Life of Brian... I love that movie. There's a lot of inaccuracies, there's a lot of stuff that's like, yeah, that did happen. But someday later, that's worth an episode of its own. Like, where was I? And then you had
The poles of the monasticism.
yeah. Eventually, you had people who just started living like actual lives out in the desert, away from the sinful world, to be pure rather than being just like publicly virtuous and not sinful. I guess sitting on those poles, just showing off how cool they were. I guess, but and they started living out on their own as what they were called anchorites. And then those anchorites started living in groups, and they became known as monks in monasteries. And that's where the term comes from. It comes out of Egypt, in fact. I forgot to mention that. Probably should have while we were there, but what if actually, I think I did just passing up, but whatever. So all of this...
That was a long fucking episode. Yeah.
And, like,
There was too much time spent in the desert.
yeah. So, then all of this is going on in the background. There's all of this kind of... There's now, after the empire is largely converted, as people are being brought over, and state policy is more and more stamping down on paganism, trying to present Christianity as like a state, one of the world's first true state religions. There started to be some arguments, because there was no longer this outside pressure forcing people to at least pretend to get along. I mean, the emperor was telling Christians not to kill each other, which they did sometimes, but not often, but it happened. There were often riots where people who believed one thing would try and kill people who believed another thing. But like, there was room enough for theological debate, and there was room enough for because people had spent centuries trying to like up their game and present themselves as intelligent. You had people who were actually like well educated and well informed, starting to have their own opinions about what various parts of scripture meant and various. You had a lot of people who spent just books and books trying to reconcile the stuff Plato wrote with Christian theology, which was successful enough that, like, I've heard it said modern, like, the root of Christian theology is really about half, like, the Judeo-Christian heritage and half Greek philosophy. A lot of basic Christian thought, stuff that's not directly in the Bible, the stuff you use to interpret the Bible, is taken straight from Plato. So there's all of this going on. And but a lot of the fiercest shit, the stuff that people died over, came over what's called Christology. The idea that there is basically debates on what Christ is. Because you have Jews are monotheists. There are I know it's a little more complicated than pure monotheism than what people realize, because there's some room around the edges for other supernatural beings, and that's not the case in every form of monotheism.
I always heard it put that Jews acknowledge there are other gods, but have no other god before me.
Yeah, I think I said that early on as an important part of Judaism. So there's room for that. But still, there's no other god before it. Like, there was a level of like centralization in religion in early Christianity where there was no other god, period. And a lot of them just straight out denied that was a thing. And which meant now you had a god that had two parts, was also one part. You had the Father and the Son, who was also the God. And a lot of people who looked at that and went, so what the fuck do we do with this? And they spent years, centuries, fighting over it. Like we talked about Arianism earlier. And that was one solution that put God, the Father on top and the Son below. And there were others like Nestorianism, which had them entirely separate, connected. There was Monophysitism, which had them basically one and the same thing. They weren't actually separate; they were just two different sides of the same coin. Like there's
how is that different from Arian?
Arianism has a hierarchy. There's God God and the Son are separate. It's just that God is on top.
Okay.
So this meant you had a lot of people who were fighting over different like interpretations and different decisions, and because this is now religion is a national issue, that means politics are there. And even if it didn't involve the central government at all, there would have been politics given the scale of this. But there totally is. But yeah, with Christian emperors with their own opinions on what faith should be, that's led to a lot of stuff happening. And eventually,
just wait till we hit the Byzantines.
Like, after a while, this thing kind of shook out where there were in general, then and like technically today, though these days it's like different groups. Like in general, up until like the early modern era, any given area, any given Christian like administration was centered in cities. There were communities in the cities, and those communities administered to everyone around them. Those had bishops and occasionally archbishops, though that kind of came later, who administered all the bishops. And they came to this idea that there were 5 different bishops who had closest relationship to the original church, to like the original disciples. And those bishops were the leaders of the communities in Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, and Rome. And there was, at the beginning, even early on, there was an element of primacy to the one in Rome because that was supposedly descended from Peter. Like, according to
I should note, aren't all of those bishops now different strains of Christianity?
those that the ones that are currently still functional, yeah. That I'll be getting to that in a moment.
Okay, sorry.
No, that's it's a fair point. But like,
like I know there's the Coptics, the Greek Orthodox.
Yeah, the Copts out of Alexandria, the Greek Orthodox out of Constantinople. Sort of, it's complicated. But like,
I think there's a Jerusalem church too, but I'm not.
Like,
I know because there's that
okay,
that church with the
there's
ladder.
actually something going on there with Orthodox Christianity. I'm going to get to this.
Okay, sorry.
That's an important part of how this is going to shake out. So,
okay, I'm sorry.
I mean, it's a fair point to bring up because it's actually it's something that people at the time argued and shouted at each other and occasionally had fistfights during ecumenical councils about, like.
Oh, and the guy who shit himself to death giving a speech.
Yeah, and that discredited his position. I think that was an Nestorian actually.
Yeah, that was Council of Nicaea. I think he gave a speech, anti-Arianism speech, and he'd been poisoned or something, and he literally shit out in his intestines.
Well, early church can get pretty wild. Like, so, okay, you had these five bishops. They're called, got the name the Patriarch, because the head of the family, the father, and that's where, by the way, the name Pope comes from Papa, and which is the Italian word for father, and because he's the father, he's also the first bishop, pretty much.
Il Papa.
And there were as people were trying to figure this stuff out, they would hold these meetings called ecumenical councils, which basically meant ecumenical means of everything of the world. And they'd get all the Christians who would listen to gather together somewhere, and they'd all argue over faith, and usually at the end of a council, they'd decide one branch of Christianity was heretical and expel them, and then they would never attend the rest of the councils. And they've managed to squeeze out the Nestorians, the Monophysites. They've worked out something called the Nicene Creed, which I'm not going to get into, but like, basically, if you ever heard of the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, that was a political compromise invented in the 300s specifically for the Council of Nicaea. So they would stop trying to kill each other over that. Because it barely makes sense. It barely made sense to them, but it had enough theological backing that they could develop it into something. If that makes sense. It's complicated. I probably shouldn't be going into that. It was probably a really offensive way for me to put that, but.
Oh, believe me, anyone who is a believer enough to get offended does not watch this.
Yeah, fair enough.
We have a max of 15 views, like, per video.
Yeah, fair. But like,
no one is watching this.
But like,
this is entirely a passion project of mine.
Like, where was I? So you get
you
this,
had just
like,
explained the ecumenical councils.
So you got a lot of wrangling after all these decisions. And yet the Christian community kept growing as people kept fighting about it. Because now the first, like, missionary activities started succeeding, except they weren't the same. But a lot of the groups that they pushed to the sidelines just left. And then went out into, like, the Arians, after they gave them the boot, went north and started converting Germanic tribes, who ended up taking over most of the Western Empire. The Nestorians, after they kicked them out, went east, and like there are still Nestorian churches throughout Asia. Like, and even in the Roman Empire, everyone started converting, and there were more and more Roman people who identified as Christians. Some of whom, like there were churches in Armenia and Ethiopia that converted separately from the bigger Christian world in the Roman Empire, who had very little interest in following what people in half a continent away thought. And it got so after a few centuries, and as the Western Empire fell, and that made church administration even more important in the area, because that was kind of the only stable political order in the area for a long time. Had people fighting over these 5 patriarchs. So, because the idea is, okay, so how do we structure this? We have this loose association of 5 patriarchs who have their own rough spheres of influence and administer unequal areas of the empire, or the Christian world, really. Or do we centralize it? And if so, who takes the top spot? And the Bishop of Rome said, I take the top spot. And the other 5 patriarchs said, nobody does, but the guy in Constantinople's first among equals. And there was a lot of bad blood over this. A lot of people did not like I mentioned, people getting in fist fights. That was at the 7th Ecumenical Council, I think in the 900s. And there were, according to legend, the monks from both sides got in a fight in the middle of the council. They started fighting on the steps outside, and there was a huge brawl. It interrupted the council, and they had to drive them out before they could continue. It got really heated and really political, where it had been theological at first, but as they worked this stuff out, it got more and more political until the political aspect took over everything else. And eventually, as Western Europe, basically, at first, things were really loose for maybe between, let's say, fall of the Roman Empire and maybe 1000 AD, or maybe 1100 AD. Actually, let's put it Gregory the Great. So over that, over half a millennium, the area that Rome claimed primacy over was kind of disorganized and didn't actually give them that much power compared to the smaller but way better settled, more organized areas in the east. And then they got organized, and medieval Europe got in full swing, and the church started actually exerting political influence in Western Europe. You had in the 1200s, it had gotten to the point where King John of England was able to basically, selling this short, basically mortgage the country off to the Pope and swear allegiance to the papacy as a vassal state. And that was a thing that was practical to do all the way from London to Rome. And that made the church really, really powerful in the West compared to everybody else. And eventually, in, I think, 1153, there was a point where shit got so intense that I think it was the Patriarch in Constantinople, over a relatively minor issue, basically told it that this is enough, get in line with the rest of the church. And the other one said, no, fuck you. And the church split in parts. So the western half went on to become the Roman Catholic Church. The eastern half it became the Orthodox Church, but it's not really a good, accurate way to think of it as a single church, because it was always kind of decentralized. The church in Constantinople was the first among equals, but they developed a concept called autocephaly, which is basically literally means being self-headed, where different areas would be headed by their own patriarch or religious, literally patriarch, and that person had ultimate authority in their area. The other Orthodox patriarchs, they could have a say. That say would be sending them letters telling them this is a bad idea, and then the patriarch could do whatever. It was entirely
fun fact. This has modern implications because the Russian Orthodox Patriarch does not recognize the Ukrainian Orthodox Patriarch.
Yeah, they actually split in I think it was 2015. It was before the invasion of Ukraine recently, but they actually schismed and set up an independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church because they would not tolerate the Russian Orthodox Church leadership. And That's
Oh, we got 9 seconds.
okay.
So that's
how
a
that
brief
happened.
overview.
Thank you, everybody.